All right, you guys, I just want to do a little bit of a basic camera control review. I know that in Module 1, that lecture, the basic camera control lecture, is like a really long and dense lecture. It's definitely the longest and densest lecture that I'm going to be giving you guys this semester, but there's a lot of information that I got to get across to you guys before you're out there making photos with your cameras in manual settings. So, I don't want you to be intimidated by it. I don't expect you to walk away from listening to that lecture once being like, oh, I'm a total expert. I get all of this stuff. My style is to kind of dump a ton of information on you, and then we're going to spend the next week or two combing through that information and making sure that it really makes sense to you. So it's going to take some practice, and that's the thing about photography is like, I can't just tell you how to use a camera. You're going to learn from actually doing. You have to go out there in the world and use the tools to get better at it. So I just want to run through a relatively quick little review of the important information from Camera Basics with some different images. So on top we have our apertures, which are also called f-stops. On the left we have f1. All the way to the right we have f32. So in this scale, f1 would be the largest aperture, f32 would be the smallest aperture. That's the adjustable size of your lens. We'll talk about that in a moment. Shutter speed is always measured in seconds. So if on the top left we have 1 over 1, which would be 1 second. Down in the bottom right we have 1 over 1,000, which would be 1/1000th of a second. So those are what we refer to in both apertures and shutter speeds, full stops. So those are all full stops. Most of your cameras can make changes about a third of a stop or a half of a stop. But we're not going to get bogged down with that because remember, we have light meters in our cameras and we're always just trying to balance out the light meter. So aperture, it's the adjustable size of the opening of the lens that controls the amount of light that passes through and hits your sensor. Right, so on this scale, these are pretty normal apertures. We have f2 in the far left, all the way to f32 in the far right. So f2.8 is a large aperture, which would create a shallow depth of field. f32 is a small aperture, which would create a large depth of field. Remember, when we're talking about stops, we're always talking about halves and doubles. So f11 is letting in half as much light as f8. But f4 is letting in double the amount of light of f5.6. So, as we move to the left, we have less depth of field. So the larger the aperture, the less depth of field. The more of the scene will be out of focus. And as we move to the right, we have a smaller aperture, more of the scene will be in focus, a larger depth of field. So I have an example of the same photo taken with different apertures. So this would be on my camera that I was using. f4 is the largest aperture. If you're using a zoom lens, f4 might be your largest aperture too. So in this example, the owl is in focus. Everything else falls out of focus. f5.6, well, now the owl's in focus and we can start to read the text on the wine cork. If we go down to f8, now we can see the owl all the way to the W's in focus. If we go f11, now the photo is in focus as well, so the owl to the photo. f16, now the glass bulb in the background is in focus. f22, we can start seeing, I would say that the wine bottle is in focus and even the lamp behind it. So now let's look at a really deep scene, because this scene right here, we have depth from the owl to that back counter, or I'm sorry, that back shelf back there. But now let's look at a really deep scene. So this is a scene where with f2.8, which is a shallow depth of field, we have just the very left edge of the dock in focus. If we move to f4, we get a little bit more of the dock in focus. f5.6, we got probably half the dock in focus. f8, 3/4 of the dock in focus. f11, I would say that we got the whole dock in focus, the boat on the right's in focus, and I would say that that seagull is getting pretty close to in focus as well. f16, I would say all of that is in focus as well as the dock in the background. f22, now those trees in the far distance are getting in focus. And f32, everything is super sharp. So f32 is a pretty specialized aperture. Most of your lenses probably won't have f32 on it, but it'll have f22, which is relatively everything is in sharp, is in focus and sharp. So That is a description of aperture and depth of field. f2.8, large aperture, creates a shallow depth of field. f32, small aperture, large depth of field. Alright, now let's transition and talk about shutter speeds. So shutter speeds refer to the amount of time that the shutter is open on your camera. The longer it's open, the more light that's coming into the camera. So a fast shutter speed freezes motion, or stops motion. A slow shutter speed is going to show motion through blur. So let's look at some examples. So here's a wave crashing that was taken with a fast shutter speed. Notice that the waves are frozen in time. We can say that the shutter, which was moving at 1/1000th of a second, was moving faster than the waves. Now let's look at the other side, slow shutter. So 1/15th of a second is a slow shutter speed. The waves were moving faster. They're blurred. Okay, so here is kind of a confusing slide, but I just want you to remember this rule. Anytime that we use a shutter speed of less than 1/60th of a second, now this slide dives into the actual equation to figure out with what lens you're using what this actual number is, but we're just going to say as a general rule, anytime you go below 1/60th of a second, so we're talking 1/30th, 1/15th, 1/8th, 1/4th, 1/2, 1 second, you have got to use a tripod. If you don't, you're going to have the actual shake of you holding the camera as part of the photo, which means your photo is going to be blurry. We probably don't want that. So anytime you use a shutter speed of less than 1/50th, 1/60th of a second, use a tripod. It's going to be your friend. Alright, now let's talk about ISO real quick. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. The only reason you'd ever need to know that is if you end up on Jeopardy. The thing that you need to know is your sensor is adjustable in how sensitive it is to light. The smaller the number, the less sensitive to light your sensor will be set at. So ISO 100 is the least sensitive on this scale, where ISO 6400 is the most sensitive. You'd want to use a really high ISO, which would be more sensitive in really dark settings, like if you were out taking photos at night. You'd want to use an ISO of a 100 if you were taking photos in broad daylight. So it's never, with everything with photography, it's give and take. And so a higher ISO is more sensitive, but the pixels are actually larger and they're going to be more visible. So you're going to end up with what's called a noisy image the higher ISO you go. So I always try to use the less sensitive ISO that I possibly can in a scene. So my simple rule for this is when I'm photographing outside during the day, I set my camera to ISO 100. When I'm inside a building, a house, whatever, I would set my ISO to 400 to 800. If I was outside photographing at night, I would set my ISO to like 1600. I don't really go beyond 1600 because I don't want all that digital noise in my pictures. And some of your cameras might go up to something crazy like ISO 25,000. Just because it goes that high doesn't mean you should go that high, because it really does have a loss of quality after, I would say, 3200, somewhere around there. Alright, so those are our giant big things that we want to get from these lectures. How we're going to use aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to work together to control the exposure. Aperture and shutter speed, we're going to be changing from photo to photo. ISO, we're going to change based on the setting that we're making photos in. So, now I want to talk about the concept of equivalent exposures. Remember that your light meter is going to tell you what you can make a good exposure with, but that doesn't mean you have to stick to those numbers. So, let's just say that we're out taking photos of our cat in the daylight, it's bright, sunny, and we're using ISO 100. Our light meter is telling us that if we shoot at f8 at 1/125th of a second, it would be a correct exposure. But we decide, right, okay, we could take that photo, but I want to make a really shallow depth of field. I want the cat to be in focus, and I want everything else to be out of focus. So I bump my aperture down to f4. Well, what would I have to do with my shutter speed? So if I bumped my aperture down to f4, right, 2 stops from f8 to f4, I would then have to bump my shutter speed up from 1/125th of a second to 1/500th of a second. That would be the same amount of light, just divided differently, entering your camera. that is how you can change your settings. But remember, these are not things that you just need to memorize because you have your light meter, which is a handy tool to use. Okay, now let's jump into the concept of digital noise. We talked about it a little bit with the ISO. So digital noise is created two different ways. It's like a gritty, colory texture that we see in digital files. It's created by high ISO, so we're talking like 6400 ISO up, or it's created by long shutter speeds. And when I say long shutter speeds, I mean anything over like 1 second. What happens when you do long shutter speeds is your sensor gets really hot and you start getting these color pixels in there, these weird miscolor pixels in there. And so you'll end up with these weird fringe colors in your image, which is called digital noise. So I'm going to show you a little ISO and noise test that I did. We have on the left this like black computer case, and in the back we have a pillowcase, white and black, and I'm just going to show you how the digital noise starts to pop up. Now I know that you guys are probably watching this video that's being hosted on YouTube, which is probably not the best quality, so it might be hard to see this resolution, but I think once we get to the end you'll be able to see it. So ISO 100, really fine noise. We're not seeing any like weird color casts, anything like that. 200, still not seeing it. 400, I begin to start seeing a little bit of texture in the blacks. 800, I'm seeing a little bit more texture in the black. These are still really good though. 1600, I can start seeing a little bit of noise in the blacks, not so much in the whites. 3200, I definitely can see texture in the blacks, not in the whites yet though. 6400, the black is starting to get a little grayish. It's starting to get this like gray overtone to it. So now let's look at a side-by-side comparison. So on the left we have ISO 100, which is a really less sensitive ISO, fine noise, no grain, no texture in it. It's just a smooth transition. On the right we have ISO 6400, and we start seeing the noise, the weird like fringe color pixels in the black case. So I'm going to pause this lecture for now, and we're going to pick it up in part 2. And I hope that this is helping you clarify your camera basics stuff.